The crystal chandeliers inside the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco shimmered above a room full of investors, venture capitalists, and media executives. Outside the tall glass windows, the lights of the Bay Bridge reflected against the dark water like scattered diamonds. It was supposed to be the celebration before Caldwell Biotech went public on NASDAQ. Nathaniel Caldwell stood tall near the stage, adjusting the cuff of his tailored tuxedo. His Rolex caught the light as cameras flashed. Behind him, a massive digital screen displayed the company's projected valuation, $2.4 billion. Then he lifted the microphone. "I want to thank everyone who believed in me," he said smoothly. "Every empire requires sacrifice." Abigail Caldwell stood near the back of the ballroom, wearing a simple navy dress. No diamonds, no spotlight, just quiet dignity. Nate's voice shifted, cooler. "And sometimes," he continued, "you outgrow people who were never truly part of the vision." A murmur rippled across the room. He didn't look at her when he said it. "As of today, Abigail and I are divorcing. She was never involved in building this company. This success is mine." The words landed harder than applause ever could. Across the room, their 16-year-old son, Liam, froze beside the dessert table. He had never seen his mother look small before. But under those chandeliers, she did. Phones lifted. Whispers spread. A CNBC reporter typed quickly on her iPad. Abigail didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply folded her hands in front of her and nodded once, as if accepting a weather forecast. But in her clutch purse was a thin silver flash drive. And inside that drive were documents no one in that ballroom knew existed. Not the board, not the investors, and certainly not the man who had just erased her from his empire. Because the truth was simple. Without her money, without her signature, there would be no IPO tomorrow. And Nate Caldwell had just humiliated the one person who could stop everything. 8 years earlier, there were no chandeliers, no tuxedos, no billion-dollar projections glowing on a screen. There was only a cramped 2-room office in Palo Alto, the paint slightly peeling near the window, and a second-hand desk Nate had bought off Craigslist. Caldwell Biotech was nothing more than a risky idea and a stack of unpaid invoices. The air smelled like burnt coffee. Nate paced the narrow room, running both hands through his hair. "No, if we don't secure bridge funding by Friday, payroll bounces," he muttered. Abigail sat quietly across from him, her old MacBook Air open, spreadsheets glowing softly in the dim light. She had already run the numbers 3 times. The company had 48 hours before investors pulled out completely. "What about the venture firm in Menlo Park?" she asked gently. "They want more equity," Nate snapped. "They think I'm desperate." He was desperate. That night, long after Nate fell asleep on the office couch, Abigail stayed awake. She logged into a private account under her maiden name, funds left to her by her late father, money she had promised herself she would never touch unless it was for her child's future. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. $5 million. It was enough to stabilize operations, cover payroll, and buy time. But it would mean placing the funds through a Delaware trust structure she designed herself, quietly, legally, invisibly. The next morning, Nate received confirmation of emergency capital. He didn't ask too many questions. "You're incredible," he said, kissing her forehead. "I'll make this up to you. One day, everyone will know what I built." Abigail smiled. She never corrected him. But buried in the incorporation documents filed that week, documents she personally drafted, was one clause granting founding shareholder authority tied to her original capital injection. A clause Nate never bothered to read. And that clause would one day decide who truly owned the empire. The prenup was signed on a rainy afternoon in Boston, 3 months before their wedding. Abigail remembered the sound of the pen more than the words. Some soft scratch against heavy paper. Final. Clean. Irreversible. Nate had framed it as protection. "It's just practical," he told her, sitting across from her in a quiet conference room. "Investors like stability. They don't want complications." At the time, Caldwell Biotech was still fragile. No one could predict it would grow into a company preparing for NASDAQ. Abigail had skimmed the document. Most of it favored Nate, clearly heavily. Any future valuation of the company would remain solely his. Any appreciation in assets tied to corporate growth would be excluded from marital division. She had paused only once. "What about capital contributions made during the marriage?" she asked. Nate's attorney smiled politely. "If properly documented as equity, of course it would be recognized." Properly documented. Abigail signed. What Nate never realized was that the $5 million she injected later was never listed as a marital gift. It was structured as secured founder capital through a trust bearing her maiden name. Legally separate, strategically silent. Years passed. As the company grew, the prenup became Nate's shield. In arguments, he would say it casually. "You'll always be taken care of," he'd assure her, "but the company is mine." Each time, Abigail felt something small crack inside her. She had never wanted control. She only wanted acknowledgement. Now, standing on the edge of divorce, the prenup that was meant to protect Nate was about to become the very document that protected her. Because hidden in its fine print was one oversight. It protected future growth, but it never erased original ownership. And original ownership was something Nate had unknowingly signed away the day he trusted her to save him. The change did not happen overnight. It arrived quietly, dressed in good lighting and careful language. Charlotte Pierce entered Caldwell Biotech as Director of Strategic Communications the year revenues doubled. She was sharp, polished, and understood how markets responded to stories. Not numbers. Stories. Within weeks, Nate's interviews changed. The humble startup founder became the relentless self-made visionary. The struggling husband narrative disappeared. In its place was a cleaner image. Disciplined, singular, unstoppable. At first, Abigail admired Charlotte's skill. She knew perception influenced valuation. She had worked in finance long enough to understand that. But slowly, something shifted. Family photos disappeared from Nate's office. The framed picture of Abigail holding Liam at age 5 was replaced by a minimalist skyline print of San Francisco. During media training sessions, Charlotte began coaching Nate to say, "I sacrificed everything for this company." Everything. Abigail watched from the edge of conference rooms as Nate rehearsed sound bites. "What about mentioning the early investors?" she asked once, gently. Charlotte offered a professional smile. "The market responds better to singular leadership." Singular. That word echoed. Soon invitations stopped, including her name. Dinners with venture capitalists at upscale restaurants in Palo Alto became executive only. Nate began returning home later, his explanations shorter. "It's optics," he would say. "Investors prefer clarity." Clarity meant removing anything that complicated the narrative, including her. Then came the magazine cover. Nate stood alone against a glass backdrop overlooking the bay. Headline reading, "The Man Who Built Biotech's Next Giant." Abigail studied the article carefully. Not once was her name mentioned. Not in the early funding section. Not in the founding history. Nowhere. That night, as Nate slept beside her, she opened her laptop and reread the original incorporation agreement. For the first time, she began saving copies outside the company server. Because image could be edited, but documents could not. Abigail did not confront him after the gala. She did not scream. She did not throw accusations across the marble kitchen island in their Palo Alto home. Instead, The morning after the public humiliation, when she packed one suitcase, not the designer luggage from their European trips, just a simple carry-on she had owned for years. She folded her clothes carefully, placed her laptop inside, and slipped the silver flash drive into the inner pocket. Liam watched from the hallway. "Are you leaving for good?" he asked quietly. She knelt in front of him, steadying her voice. "I'm stepping back for a little while. That's different." He nodded, but confusion clouded his eyes. By noon, Abigail was driving across the Golden Gate Bridge toward Sausalito. The fog hung low over the water, thick and quiet, matching the silence inside her chest. She rented a modest waterfront cottage under her maiden name. No press, no announcements. That evening, Nate's legal team emailed formal divorce papers. The message was brief, clinical. In exchange for signing quickly and avoiding public dispute, she would receive a generous settlement. Confidentiality required. No claims against company ownership. It was designed to look kind. It was designed to end her. Abigail read every page twice. Buried in the language was a clause referencing no outstanding founder authority. She almost smiled, because that statement was not legally accurate. Instead of replying, she opened a secure cloud folder and uploaded copies of the original trust documentation, capital transfer confirmations, and incorporation filings. Then she made one phone call. Daniel Brooks, independent board member. He answered on the second ring. "I wondered when you'd call," he said calmly. Abigail looked out at the dark water beyond her window. "They think I'm walking away," she replied softly. Daniel paused. Are you?" Daniel Brooks did not waste words. "Before you decide anything," he said, "you need to understand what the board knows and what they don't." Abigail sat at the small wooden table in the Sausalito cottage, her laptop open, the ocean barely visible through the fog. The world felt far away from the glittering ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton. "What don't they know?" she asked. "They don't know the original founder authority clause is still active," Daniel replied. Nate amended later agreements, but the first filing was never legally dissolved, and your capital injection activated protective voting rights. Abigail closed her eyes for a moment. She remembered drafting that clause late at night 8 years earlier. A safeguard, not for herself, but for the company. "If I invoke it," she said slowly, "the IPO pauses." "Yes," Daniel answered, "immediately." That was the first crack in the illusion Nate had built, but Daniel's voice shifted. "There's more." Abigail felt her pulse tighten. "The emergency loan you structured through the trust? Nate personally guaranteed additional private debt 2 years ago. It wasn't disclosed fully to the board." Her fingers stilled on the keyboard. "If that surfaces during IPO review, it triggers regulatory scrutiny," Daniel finished. "At best, delay. At worst, investigation." Abigail's mind raced. She had not known about the personal guarantee. Nate had handled that round alone. For the first time, she realized something unsettling. He hadn't just erased her from the story. He had started making reckless decisions without her. And now the empire he claimed was entirely his stood on fragile disclosures. "If I stay silent," she whispered, "employees keep their stability." "And if you don't?" Daniel asked. Abigail looked at the documents glowing on her screen. She wasn't holding revenge. She was holding leverage. And for the first time since the gala, she understood the truth. Nate hadn't pushed her out. He had unknowingly handed her control. 3 days after the gala, the first article appeared. The headline was subtle but sharp. "CEO's estranged wife steps away as company prepares for historic IPO." The wording sounded neutral. The tone was not. Anonymous sources described Abigail as uninvolved in day-to-day operations and financially dependent on executive compensation. One line mentioned her taste for private events and high-end jewelry, as if that defined her contribution to 8 years of work. Abigail read it on her laptop while sitting by the window in Sausalito. The fog had lifted, revealing sailboats drifting calmly across the bay. The contrast made her chest ache. Her phone buzzed. A second article, then a third. A lifestyle blog reposted photos from past galas, zooming in on a Cartier bracelet Nate had once gifted her for their anniversary. The implication was clear. She enjoyed the rewards, not the struggle. Liam called that evening. "Mom, kids at school saw it," he said quietly. "They're saying you're trying to take Dad's money." Abigail closed her eyes. That hurt more than the ballroom. "I never wanted his money," she said gently. "I wanted our family." There was a pause. "Then why are they saying you're suing him?" Because the narrative was being shaped. Charlotte was good at this. Abigail knew that. Carefully placed language. Selective leaks. Sympathy tilted toward the visionary CEO navigating personal hardship before going public. Abigail could respond publicly. She could release documents, correct the record, expose the truth. But if she did, markets would panic. Employees would fear instability. Investors would question governance. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She said nothing. She let the story build, because every exaggerated claim created a paper trail. Every false statement strengthened the legal argument. And somewhere inside the company's compliance department, someone was starting to notice inconsistencies. The smear was meant to weaken her, but it was slowly tightening around Nate instead. Liam came to Sausalito on Saturday afternoon. He arrived with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a look that made Abigail's heart sink. 16 was too young to carry public opinion on your back, yet that was exactly what he had been forced to do. They sat at the small kitchen table facing the water. Abigail poured him a glass of lemonade, the same way she had when he was 10 and came home upset after Little League games. He didn't touch it. "Dad says you never wanted the spotlight," Liam began carefully. "He says you chose to stay out of the company." Abigail nodded slowly. "No, I did choose to stay out of interviews." "That's not what I mean." His voice tightened. "Did you actually help build it?" There it was. Not anger. Not accusation. Just doubt. And that hurt the most. Abigail folded her hands together. "When your dad's company almost closed 8 years ago, I helped with the financial structure. I handled some early funding decisions. Quietly." "Why quietly?" Liam asked. "Because at the time, what mattered was keeping everyone employed, not getting credit." He stared at the floor. "People at school say you're trying to take half of everything now." Abigail reached across the table but stopped short of touching him. "I don't want half. I want what's fair. And I want the truth." He looked up then, really looked at her. "Really? Guy, are you going to destroy Dad's company?" The question lingered between them like fog rolling in. She could have promised no. She could have chosen the easy answer. Instead, she spoke honestly. "I'm going to protect what I helped build. That includes the people who work there. And you." Liam swallowed. "Then why does it feel like a war?" Because sometimes, Abigail thought, the quietest person in the room holds the loudest truth. And that truth was getting closer to being heard. While Abigail stayed silent in Sausalito, Nate went louder than ever. The IPO roadshow began in New York, inside a sleek conference hall overlooking Manhattan's skyline. Investors filled the room. Hedge fund managers, institutional buyers, analysts with sharp questions and sharper instincts. Nate stood under controlled lighting, sleeves tailored perfectly, a confidence rehearsed. "Caldwell Biotech represents resilience," he declared. "Every challenge strengthened our foundation." Slides flashed behind him. Revenue growth, expansion pipelines, global partnerships. He told the story of the early struggle, the near bankruptcy, the sleepless nights. He did not mention Abigail. After New York came Boston, then Chicago, then back to San Francisco. Each stop refined the narrative. Self-made, singular, visionary. Financial news channels praised his discipline. Commentators called him the face of modern biotech leadership. In Palo Alto, large screens in the company lobby displayed countdown clocks to the NASDAQ listing date. Employees cheered. Champagne orders were placed. Meanwhile, compliance teams prepared final disclosures. Lawyers combed through filings. Underwriters triple-checked signatures required for founder authority certifications. That was when the first quiet email surfaced. Subject line: clarification on founding shareholder consent. The message was internal, routine, almost invisible. It requested confirmation that all original founding equity holders had formally waived additional voting rights prior to IPO activation. Nate skimmed it between flights. He forwarded it to legal with a short note. Already handled years ago. But in Sausalito, Abigail received a separate alert from Daniel. "They're verifying signatures," he told her over the phone. "Your waiver isn't in the file." Abigail stood by the window, watching the tide move steadily in and out. For 8 years, she had allowed Nate to speak for both of them. Now the market itself was asking a question, and the answer required only one thing: her signature. Without it, there would be no opening bell on NASDAQ, and the countdown clock inside the company lobby was still ticking. The official email arrived Monday morning. It was polite, professional, routine on the surface. Final confirmation required from all founding equity holders prior to activation of IPO registration. Abigail read it twice. There it was, the clause she had written 8 years ago at a folding desk in a nearly empty office. The language was simple but firm. Any public offering required written consent from all original capital contributors holding protective voting authority. She had never waived it. In Palo Alto, Nate sat at the head of the executive table, legal counsel on one side, Charlotte on the other. A large digital screen displayed the final IPO timeline. Just a technicality," his lead attorney assured him. "We'll send over the standard waiver for her signature." Nate exhaled, mildly irritated. "Handle it. I don't want delays." Within an hour, a courier delivered a sealed envelope to Abigail's cottage in Sausalito. Inside was a neatly printed waiver agreement and a short cover note. "For efficiency and mutual benefit, we request your prompt signature." Mutual benefit. Abigail placed the paper on the kitchen table and stared at it. Signing meant immediate settlement money. Clean headlines. No public fight. Not signing meant uncertainty. Markets hated uncertainty. Her phone buzzed. Daniel. "If you sign," he said calmly, "the IPO proceeds. Nate keeps control. The narrative stays intact. And if I don't, trading halts before it begins." Abigail walked outside onto the small deck overlooking the water. The tide was strong that morning, waves pushing firmly against the shore. For years, she had absorbed impact quietly. Now the system required her consent to move forward. Back in Palo Alto, Nate's team waited for confirmation. They were confident. After all, why would she risk crashing $1 billion offering? Abigail returned inside, picked up a pen, and did something no one expected. She set it down. Unsigned. Because the hidden clause was no longer hidden, and neither was she. When Nate learned the waiver had not been signed, he didn't panic. He adjusted. "Reschedule the pricing call," he told the underwriters calmly. "Minor documentation delay." Publicly, nothing changed. Privately, our pressure increased. To reassure investors, Charlotte arranged an exclusive pre-IPO celebration in Napa Valley. a curated guest list, private vineyard estate, soft lighting, string quartet, carefully staged optimism. Nate arrived in a black Mercedes S-Class, stepping out with controlled confidence. Cameras captured every angle. Articles the next morning framed the delay as standard procedural review. Inside the estate, champagne flowed. Nate lifted a glass. To resilience, he declared. Short delays only strengthen long-term value. Applause followed. Then, in a move designed for headlines, he reached for Charlotte's hand. Life is about moving forward, he said. And I'm grateful to have someone beside me who understands the future. The room reacted instantly. Surprise, approval, flashbulbs. Charlotte smiled. I poised, but slightly tense. Across social media, images spread within minutes. New chapter. Fresh start. Visionary CEO unburdened by personal complications. Back in Sausalito, Abigail saw the photos on her laptop. She studied Nate's expression carefully. He believed momentum was on his side. He believed the market would pressure her into compliance. But as guests clinked glasses in Napa, a different kind of review was unfolding. The underwriters had escalated the missing consent issue to regulatory counsel. Standard protocol required verification of founder authority disclosures in the original S-1 filing. Verification meant paperwork. Paperwork meant scrutiny. And scrutiny had a way of uncovering more than intended. Late that evening, Daniel called again. They're asking about the early trust structure, he said quietly. What, specifically the capital guarantee? Abigail's voice remained steady. He told them everything was disclosed. Daniel paused. It wasn't. At that vineyard, under warm lights and celebratory music, Nate believed he had contained the problem. He had no idea the real review had just begun. The tremor didn't feel dramatic at first. It came as a quiet phone call from one of the lead underwriters in New York. We need clarification, the voice said evenly. There appears to be an undisclosed personal guarantee linked to early bridge financing. In Palo Alto, Nate tightened his jaw. That was resolved years ago, he replied. It has no bearing on current valuation. Nevertheless, the underwriter continued, regulatory counsel is requesting documentation. Documentation. The word echoed like a crack forming beneath polished marble. Within hours, internal emails multiplied. Compliance officers reopened archived files. Legal teams revisited amendments filed during the second funding round. That was when they noticed something else. The founder consent waiver was not the only missing piece. The trust that injected the original $5 million was still active on record. It had never been formally dissolved, only assumed dormant. Assumed. By midday, one institutional investor paused its commitment pending clarification. It wasn't a withdrawal, it was worse. It was hesitation. Financial media began asking subtle questions. IPO timing adjusted amid routine governance review, one headline read. Employees felt the shift immediately. The countdown clock in the lobby still ticked, but conversations grew quieter. Executives avoided eye contact in hallways. Charlotte requested an emergency strategy meeting. We control the narrative, she insisted. This is procedural. But numbers don't respond to narrative. Markets respond to certainty. And certainty was slipping. In Sausalito, Abigail received copies of the inquiry requests through Daniel. She read each line slowly. No accusations yet. Just verification. She understood what that meant. The moment regulators start asking for clarification, the spotlight widens. Nate had built his public image on control. Now external review was beginning to question that control. Late that evening, Nate finally called her. For the first time in weeks, his voice was not polished. What exactly are you trying to do? He asked. Abigail answered calmly. I'm not trying to do anything, Nate. The silence that followed was heavier than anger. Because for the first time, He realized she wasn't reacting. She was allowing the system to speak. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 7 a.m. at headquarters in Palo Alto. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the early morning light. The long glass table reflected tense faces. Investors, legal advisors, independent directors. No champagne, no cameras, just risk. Nate stood at the head of the table, composed but pale. "This is a procedural review," he began. "There is no material threat to valuation." Before anyone could respond, the conference room doors opened. Abigail walked in. No dramatic entrance, no raised voice. Just a navy blazer, a leather portfolio, and steady eyes. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. They had not expected her to attend. Daniel Brooks rose slightly from his chair. As an original capital contributor with active founder authority, she has the right to be here." Silence thickened. Nate's expression hardened. "This isn't necessary." Abigail met his gaze calmly. "It is." She placed a folder on the table and slid copies across to each member. Inside were the original trust documents, capital transfer confirmations, and the incorporation filing bearing her maiden name as founding equity holder. "I never waived my voting rights," she said evenly. "And the personal guarantee taken during the second funding round was not fully disclosed in the amended S1. A murmur rippled around the table. One board member adjusted his glasses. "Is this accurate?" The general counsel flipped through pages quickly, color draining from his face. "The trust remains legally active," he admitted, "and the disclosure language may be incomplete." Nate stepped forward. "This is being exaggerated." Abigail didn't raise her voice. "If the IPO proceeds without full disclosure, regulatory review escalates," she said. "That risk affects every shareholder in this room." She wasn't threatening. She was protecting. The difference was subtle, but powerful. For the first time, the board wasn't looking at Nate. They were looking at her. And they were beginning to realize something unsettling. The woman they had assumed was outside the company had just demonstrated the deepest understanding of its foundation. The room felt smaller after the documents were distributed. Board members flipped through pages in tense silence. The only sound was the soft shuffle of paper and the distant hum of traffic outside the glass tower. Nate tried to regain control. "This is old financing," he said sharply. "It has no operational impact today." Abigail didn't argue. Instead, she opened her laptop and connected it to the screen at the end of the table. An email chain appeared, dated 2 years earlier. Subject line: Personal guarantee adjustment. The messages showed Nate agreeing to secure an additional private loan to stabilize a failed clinical trial. The guarantee was attached to his personal shares, but structured in a way that could trigger creditor claims if valuation dropped during IPO volatility. "You told the board the risk exposure had been neutralized," Daniel said quietly. Nate's jaw tightened. "It was managed." "Managed is not the same as disclosed," Abigail replied calmly. She clicked again. A compliance memo surfaced, flagged but never escalated, questioning whether the personal guarantee required updated filing language under SEC transparency rules. One board member leaned back heavily in his chair. "If regulators discover this post-listing, it becomes a governance issue," he said. "Not fraud, not criminal, but governance failure. And governance failures destroy investor confidence." Charlotte, seated near the end of the table, looked stunned. "You said everything was cleared," she whispered toward Nate. Nate avoided her eyes. That was the second twist. The issue was no longer about divorce. It was about disclosure integrity. Abigail closed her laptop gently. "I'm not here to collapse this company," she said. "I am here to ensure we don't walk into a preventable disaster." The board members exchanged glances. For years, Nate had been the face of certainty. Now uncertainty was attached directly to his signature. The chairman cleared his throat. "We need executive session," he said. And for the first time since the gala, Nate was asked to step outside his own boardroom. The boardroom doors closed behind Nate. For the first time since founding Caldwell Biotech, he was not inside the conversation. Abigail remained seated at the glass table. She did not look triumphant. She looked steady. After 20 minutes, the doors reopened. Not for Nate, but for Charlotte. She entered hesitantly, clutching her tablet. The chairman spoke first. "Ms. Pierce, several public statements made during the IPO roadshow referenced complete governance transparency. So, were you aware of the outstanding personal guarantee?" Charlotte's eyes shifted briefly toward the hallway where Nate waited. "No," she answered honestly. "I was told all disclosures were cleared by legal." Abigail studied her carefully. Charlotte's confidence, the polished strategist who had shaped headlines, seemed thinner now. Daniel leaned forward. "Did you draft any language minimizing early capital contributions from other founders?" Charlotte hesitated. "I drafted messaging based on executive direction," she said carefully. The narrative emphasized singular leadership. "Specifically Mr. Caldwell?" another board member asked. "Yes." There it was, the third twist. Charlotte had not orchestrated Abigail's erasure on her own. She had followed instructions. The board exchanged long, quiet looks. This was no longer a marital dispute. It was a pattern of image manipulation that now intersected with governance omissions. When Nate was finally called back in, the atmosphere had shifted. The chairman's tone was measured but firm. "The board will initiate an independent review regarding disclosure, integrity, and executive oversight." Nate's expression flickered. Anger, disbelief, calculation. "This is unnecessary," he insisted. Abigail spoke gently. "No, Nate, it's overdue." He looked at her then, not as an obstacle, not as an estranged wife, but as someone he had underestimated. The board vote would not happen that morning, but the direction was clear. Control was no longer his alone. And outside the building, financial reporters were already beginning to ask why the IPO date had quietly disappeared from the company website. The official statement was released 2 days later. For Caldwell Biotech announces temporary leadership adjustment, pending governance review. Temporary. The word softened the blow, but everyone understood what it meant. Nate Caldwell was stepping down as active CEO during the independent investigation. He would remain a shareholder, a founder, but not the decision maker. Inside the Palo Alto headquarters, the mood was fragile. Employees gathered in small clusters, whispering. Some looked worried. Others looked relieved. Abigail walked through the lobby quietly that afternoon. No press conference, no dramatic entrance, just calm steps across the polished floor where the IPO countdown clock had once stood. The screen was dark now. Daniel met her near the executive wing. "The board has asked you to serve as interim chair," he said. "You have the cleanest governance standing and the deepest historical knowledge." Abigail absorbed the weight of that. 8 years of silence. Now, responsibility. "I don't want revenge," she replied softly. "You're not being offered revenge," Daniel said. "You're being asked for stability." Meanwhile, Nate stood alone in his office, packing personal items into a leather briefcase. The skyline print still hung behind his desk. The magazine cover proclaiming him biotech's visionary leaned against the wall. He stared at it for a long moment. He had believed control meant ownership. But ownership, he was learning, required accountability. When Abigail entered the office, he didn't look up immediately. "You won," he said flatly. She shook her head. This was never about winning. He finally met her eyes. "For you, then maybe." She placed a single folder on his desk. Proposed restructuring terms designed to protect employees, preserve valuation, and resolve disclosure gaps without public collapse. "You built something real," she said quietly. "I'm trying to keep it real." Outside, markets reacted cautiously, but not violently. The company was bruised, not broken. And for the first time, leadership no longer rested on ego. It rested on transparency. The power had shifted, but the story wasn't finished yet. The press conference was scheduled for Thursday morning. No ballroom, no vineyard, just a controlled media room inside headquarters, with a simple podium and the company logo behind it. This time, Abigail stood at the center. She wore a tailored gray suit, no dramatic jewelry, no attempt at spectacle. Calm authority carried more weight than shine, and reporters filled the front rows. Cameras were live. "To our employees, investors, and partners," she began, her voice steady. "Caldwell Biotech remains financially stable. The recent leadership adjustment reflects our commitment to full transparency. No blame, no accusation, just facts." She outlined the independent review, the steps taken to correct disclosure language, and the restructuring plan that insulated employee positions from executive liability exposure. One reporter raised a hand. "Was the former CEO aware of the disclosure gaps?" Abigail paused carefully. "The review will determine the timeline of awareness," she answered. "Accountability is part of leadership." Across town, Nate watched the broadcast alone in his home office. His phone had been quiet all morning. No investor calls, no congratulatory messages, only a formal notice from the board confirming his removal as active CEO, pending final review conclusions. Later that afternoon, the board released a supplemental filing acknowledging the personal guarantee oversight. Markets dipped briefly, then stabilized. Transparency, it turned out, calmed more than denial ever could. By evening, financial news framed the story differently. Founder steps aside amid governance update. Company stability maintained. The narrative had shifted. Not scandal. Correction. Charlotte issued a brief personal statement, clarifying her role had been limited to communications strategy. She resigned quietly. There were no public humiliations, no dramatic collapses, just consequences. Nate's reputation was not destroyed, but it was changed. He was no longer the untouchable visionary, and he was the executive who underestimated governance and underestimated his wife. Meanwhile, inside headquarters, employees applauded as Abigail walked through the lobby, not because she defeated someone, but because she protected something. And that mattered more. Stability did not return overnight. For weeks, Abigail worked longer hours than she ever had before. She arrived at headquarters before sunrise, her laptop open in the quiet boardroom, while the bay was still wrapped in morning fog. The restructuring plan was precise. Disclosure amendments were filed. The personal guarantee was renegotiated and separated from corporate exposure. Independent compliance officers were hired to ensure future transparency. No shortcuts, no image polishing, just correction. Employees began to feel it. Town hall meetings replaced rumor. Questions were answered directly. Abigail stood on stage without a teleprompter and said something simple. "We made mistakes. We're fixing them. Together." That word, together, had been missing for years. Investors noticed the tone shift as well. Instead of bold promises, earnings projections were modest and realistic. Risk assessments were detailed. The roadshow resumed quietly, without spectacle. This time, Abigail signed the founder consent, not under pressure, under protection. The revised IPO date was announced without champagne or fireworks, just a press release and steady confidence. When the company finally rang the opening bell months later, it was not explosive. It was solid. Shares opened slightly below the original hype, but held steady throughout the day. Inside headquarters, employees watched the ticker in silence. Then slow smiles spread across faces. Caldwell Biotech had survived, not because of image, because of integrity. That evening, Abigail returned to Sausalito and stood on the small deck overlooking the water. The wind felt different now, lighter. Her phone buzzed, a message from Daniel. Dinner tomorrow. No board agenda, just dinner. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to smile. The company was stable. Her son was proud. And something new, unexpected and steady, was quietly beginning to grow. The school auditorium smelled faintly of polished wood and stage lights. It wasn't Wall Street. It wasn't a boardroom. It was Liam's annual academic awards night. Abigail sat in the third row, hands folded in her lap, heart beating harder than it had during any shareholder vote. She wore a simple cream blouse and dark slacks. No press, no security, no spectacle. On stage, students were invited to share short speeches about leadership and integrity. When Liam's name was called, he walked up with steady steps, taller than she remembered. He adjusted the microphone. "This year," he began, "I learned something about leadership." Abigail felt her breath catch. "My dad always taught me to work hard," Liam continued carefully. "And my mom taught me something else." He paused. "She taught me that doing the right thing is more important than looking right." The auditorium was silent. When people said things about her that weren't true, she didn't fight with noise. She fixed what was broken, even when it would have been easier to walk away. Abigail's eyes filled, but she didn't look down. "She helped build something important," Liam said, voice steady. "But more than that, she protected people when it mattered." There was gentle applause, not explosive, honest. Afterward, Liam found her near the exit. "I didn't tell Dad what I was going to say," he admitted. "You didn't have to," she replied softly. Across the parking lot, Nate stood beside his car. He had come quietly, sitting near the back row. Their eyes met briefly. No anger, no triumph, just understanding. He nodded once, small but real. Consequences had reshaped him too. As Abigail drove home that night with Liam beside her, she realized something profound. The market recovery had mattered. The board vote had mattered. But this was the victory that healed. Her son no longer doubted her, and that was worth more than any valuation. 1 year later, the view from the top floor of Caldwell Biotech looked different. Not because the skyline had changed, but because she had. Abigail now served as permanent chair of the board. The company had posted steady quarterly growth. Compliance ratings were strong. Investor trust, once shaken, had been rebuilt through consistency rather than spectacle. There were no oversized launch parties anymore, no exaggerated headlines, just quiet performance. Nate had accepted a senior advisory role at a smaller biotech firm in Seattle. Not a fall from grace, just a humbler chapter. He saw Liam regularly. Their conversations were simpler now, less about ambition, more about responsibility. On a breezy Saturday evening, Abigail stood again by the water in Sausalito. The same deck, the same tide. Daniel joined her, holding 2 cups of coffee. Hard to believe a year ago we were in crisis mode," he said lightly. She smiled. Crisis reveals character. He hesitated for a moment, then reached into his jacket pocket, not for a dramatic display, but for a small velvet box. "No board vote required," he joked softly. "Just an honest question." Inside was a simple ring, elegant, understated. "I don't admire you because you won," Daniel said. "I admire you because you chose integrity when revenge was easier." Abigail felt the wind brush against her hair. For years, she had been the silent foundation beneath someone else's empire. Now she stood as her own. "Yes," she answered. Not because she needed rescuing, but because she was choosing partnership. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting gold across the water, she understood something fully at last. Power isn't proven by erasing others. It's proven by building something strong enough to survive truth, and she had done exactly that. And so, this story comes to a close. But my wonderful friends, if you're still here with me right now, that means something. It means this story didn't just entertain you, it touched something deeper. Maybe you've been underestimated. Maybe someone erased your contribution. Maybe you stayed quiet when it would have been easier to fight loudly. Abigail's journey reminds us that integrity is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. Sometimes, strength is simply choosing not to betray your own values. There's a philosophy called ethical egoism, the idea that protecting your long-term well-being is not selfish, but necessary. When Abigail refused to sign away her rights, she wasn't destroying anyone. She was protecting what she built. As the saying goes, you are not required to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Healing doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like boundaries, accountability, choosing partners who respect you, choosing peace over pride. If this story resonated with you, if it reflected a part of your life, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us tell more stories that remind people of their worth. And remember, quiet strength always finds its moment. This story is a fictional drama created for entertainment and educational purposes. While it reflects realistic business structures, legal processes, and emotional family dynamics, the characters, company names, and events are entirely imagined. The narrative is designed to explore themes such as integrity, accountability, while leadership and personal growth in a corporate setting. It does not intend to defame, accuse, or represent any real individual, organization, or publicly traded company. Financial, legal, and governance elements mentioned in the story are simplified to support storytelling clarity and emotional impact. Viewers should not interpret this content as financial advice, legal guidance, or factual reporting. Our goal is to share meaningful, character-driven stories that encourage reflection, resilience, and ethical decision-making in everyday life.